Yes, hello. Thanks for the introduction, and sorry that I can't be with you this morning, but I'm very happy that I get the chance to tell you a bit more about HDR. And this is an overview talk. We will hear a lot more about HDR with the coming talks by all the other colleagues that work in this field. Okay, let's just start. Can we get the next slide, please? So basically, to start at the very basics is like, as you probably all know, luminance and color contrasts makes up real-world objects distinguishable. And this is also true for reproductions in the form of images, and that includes drawings, paintings, chemical photographs, digital imaging, etc. So sufficient contrast supports the expression of the reproduction, for example, in photography. Next slide. Yeah. And obviously, this has been done a lot with sufficient contrast in reflective prints, but in the past 25 years, we have seen a new field emerge and establish itself, which is called high dynamic range imaging, or HDR. And this has significantly extended the luminance and color contrast ranges that are available to imaging. So as I mentioned, since then, the HDR field has continuously been evolving and today is available and beneficial to many areas of imaging. So let's look at the reasons and the benefits of HDR and start from the beginning. So what is HDR technology? So in a nutshell, if we have this scene and you are there in person and look at it, this scene looks perfectly to you. You can see the chairs on the beach in the background, which are fairly dark. You also see the deck chairs in the foreground, and you can see all the illumination that is in there. But if you now go to a camera's view, the reproduction of the scene might not reflect exactly this reproduction. It might be just darker, and the highlights might not look that realistic. Yeah, so for example, in the real world, when you're there, you might see all the details and the colors, while in the reproduction, the details might be crushed and the colors might be lost. And the same is true for brights, for example, the details in the lights and the colors, which are visible when you're there, but might be clipped or crushed in the reproduction. So what we now want to find out is if we want to provide compelling HDR experiences, we need to consider many aspects. The first aspect is how do we perceive reality? So we need to learn how our visual system behaves and how we perceive a scene like this. Then how do we capture it with a camera? It's like here I used a very old camera, but it's like obviously this is today smartphones and many other cameras that we have readily available. The next step is then, after we capture it, how do we deliver it somewhere else so that it may be consumed by someone? And how we then display that? What can our display do? How do we address the display, etc.? And finally, how do we perceive the reproduction? So now that we know what are the challenges, what do we actually want to achieve with HDR technology? We want to experience a realistic and a compelling image quality, obviously. So, but does this mean that we need to reproduce physical reality? We need to consider that an HDR imaging ecosystem, and in particular display system, can't really reproduce all of the physical reality. But actual physical realism is typically not really required or even desired. It would be way too expensive to replicate outdoor lumens or something like that. Instead, we want to recreate the perception of a realistic world on a display. And we want to maintain the intent of the content. So the cornerstones of HDR, you might be already familiar with this, are as follows. So we want to reproduce the bright highlights. So it could be also addressed as peak brightness. We also want to address deep blacks, and we want to address the color saturation, the color volumes. So this image might look a little bit muted to you, but I'm trying to simulate how it would look going from a lower dynamic range image, or SDR, standard dynamic range, to HDR. So this presentation is still SDR, but it gives you the idea. So now we need to subdivide a little bit more in looking what elements we need to address. So one key one is that we differentiate between diffuse versus emissive and specular highlights. So peak white is not the only white that we need to address. We also need to consider the luminance and the perceptual differences between emissive and diffuse white. On the left, we have the sun. That is obviously an emissive light source, but here on the right, we see a white car. So the body of the car is diffusely painted white, and we can see this, but you can see on the right here, there's a specular highlight that is significantly brighter than the car paint. And the specular highlight, for example, now gives us the ability to see that, oh, this is actually a glossy car paint. So differentiation between diffuse, reflective white and specular highlights is important. Next slide. And if you go to the darks, we have a similar problem. So we have for example, two differences that we can render. Here is where we want to render the dark details as well as possible, but they still should be dark. But the other option is that we want to create something like a silhouette where we want to have inky deep blacks where you can't see details, but it should be really dark. And if we want to have the deep darks, we need to make sure that we have these deep darks and not lifted or muddy blacks, because if they are lifted, then we provide 2D planar cues, which will lift the image of the background, while if everything is deep and black, we don't have these 2D planar cues, and it looks more realistic. Next slide. So here is an example how this plays into realistic materials appearance. So we have here a spoon that is unglazed. It looks like it's a matte, unglazed piece of ceramic. Now we have another example, and you can see there are some highlights in there. And right away, this material appearance now switches to, okay, this is actually a glossy material, so it's a glazed spoon. And it looks fine, but now we can go and click one more. We can go and increase the brightness of the highlight. So only the brightness of the highlight changes, not anything else. And you can now see it looks glossier and glossier. So with HDR technology, we can give the headroom to the highlights, and with that make the material appearance stand out more of the objects we're showing. And this is now used with all sorts of images and storytelling. For example, here's one scene. This is a firework, and I'm pretty sure you've all seen, obviously, fireworks in your life. They normally are much more vibrant and bright than in this tone mapped image here. So this is where HDR is very beneficial to reproduce realism and fantasy. Then obviously we had this image before. Here we get the physiological response, so we have the glint and the ripple effects on the water. And obviously there are elements that have cultural or monetary value. So a diamond sparkle is what defines a diamond. And this is shown here with this diamond ring, or we have shiny objects like this car paint that reflect cultural or monetary value. It's also important for material appearance. Like here we have the subsurface scattering of these orange slices. You want to get the feeling that you want to bite into this orange slice, and it's very appetizing and everything, and HDR can help you with this appearance. And finally, it helps you with the scene appearance. Like you can see right away if this HDR, that this is actually a slippery road right after the rain, and it's white stone, so you don't really want to stumble when you walk this path. So these are the appearance descriptors, but what do we actually encounter in the real world? And one way of describing the real world is to look at the physical side and describe it with luminance. Luminance is an SI unit, and commonly it's referred to with its equivalence, which is called nits. So what we see in the real world is everything from 0 nits, which is absolute black, there are no photons present, all the way up to 1.6 billion nits, which is basically if you were to measure the disk of the sun. Don't look at it, it is dangerous. We don't look at this in real life, but just to give you the context, this is basically what the luminance would be if we were to measure it. And here are some examples, just click through them. Going from nighttime sky, you get really low luminances, like from 0.001. Click again, and click again. So you can see that the luminance levels rise all the way from really low levels when you have the deep sky at night, all the way to the 1.6 billion nits when you measure the sun. So absolute luminance does not necessarily match appearance, and this is a very important differentiation. And we can't see everything in the physical world, which we will see in a moment. So here we have the difference between the real world and what the human visual system, or HVS, actually can discern. So the minimum is 10 to the minus 6 candelas per square meter, which is the limit of night vision. And then it goes all the way up to 10 to the 8 nits, which is about 100 million nits in the peaks of day vision. But we can't see all of that at the same time. We only can see a subdivision of that, which is called steady state dynamic range, or SSDR. So to reach now everything in the visible range, we need to employ adaptive processes or adaptation, which was illustrated with this window moving up or down. So the objective of the visual system is to align visual sensitivity to the environment. So now to give you an example, again, here is this nice parking lot of our office in California again. Now, if I light adapted, a black would appear something like 40 nits, and a gray would be somewhere at 2100 nits. But if I'm darker adapted, like to an average illumination here inside the office, a black would measure 0.5 nits, and a gray would measure something like 77 nits. But we need to consider that changes of adaptation don't have to take very long. So there are temporal aspects, and it's important to consider that the visual system is not a camera, that adaptation is continuous over time, even with still images, and that changes do not have to be extreme. So here's just an example to illustrate that. You might be at first looking at, can you click? We might first look at the stained glass windows, which are a bit brighter, and you can see here's an example with a gaze pattern. And the next moment you might just look at the altar and the other parts of the church, which are a bit darker. The difference is not that large, so the changes your visual system can take is like this can be done in a few seconds. And again, this is a simplification of how everything works. It's just to illustrate the process. Next slide. So if we now go, and this is something I think Nicholas will talk a bit more in a moment, but just to briefly capture it, if you capture with a camera, seen here, if you're in a desert and you have a bright light, your visual system would be adapting to this brighter part, and we could see this. So what we want to capture is a dominant illumination of this scene, because it's how we would perceive it if we were there. The camera does that with a certain signal to noise ratio, SNR, which is basically the dynamic range of this camera. And this can be dialed in by setting an exposure value. Now we could go into a dark scene, let's say an unlit cave. Similar dynamic range, but significantly darker. Again, visual system adapts. Your camera can also do the same. It would go into the dark, and we increase the exposure time or increase the exposure value, and we can capture an image in that scene. So with that, we can go through all the dynamic range that we can see, and even beyond with all sorts of technical means. So now we have two example luminance ranges that are not very high. This is not really a challenge for the camera, but the challenge comes now with the next example. So here we have a scene that is high dynamic range. We have the background of the cave, and we have the flame of the torch that's just being lit. So this is about 3 times the dynamic range of the other two shots. What do we do here? So the camera alone can't capture this range because the range is not sufficient. What we would need is an HDR capture of this image. If we can't capture, we end up with an SDR image or LDR image, which is lower dynamic range. So how would we capture this in HDR actually? And this is now an example of the traditional approach. It's about 30 years old, and you probably have seen this approach before or in the literature. So first you capture a medium exposure of your scene here, and you can see there are clipped areas in the brights and there are crushed areas in the dark. We don't want those, we want the information. So what we can do is we can underexpose to get information about the brights and the highlights, and we can take another image where we overexpose and we get the information of the darks. And what we do then is We bring them all together and merge them together to an HDR image. So this is in the past was done manually. That's a traditional approach, but a camera does this approach of merging internally quite often nowadays. And if you're lucky, you have a camera that can actually capture everything if it has a large dynamic range. So often this is also combined 0.2 and 0.3, if you click. And mixed and achieved using AI. Next slide. So I'm jumping a bit ahead. It's like here you can see on the right, just click ahead. We want to achieve two objectives. We want to avoid contouring and we want to be efficient. And you can see on the right, the top image has contouring artifacts, which might arise if we don't have an efficient granularity encoded. What we want is to encode it efficiently as shown in the lower image. Let's jump ahead to the next slide. So there are different approaches how this can be done, but ultimately we want to avoid any contouring steps and we want an effective encoding, which can, for example, be achieved with modern HDR encoding systems. Okay, next slide. So now that we talked about how it works, the capture, the transmission, let's look at the last step, and this is the display technologies. And obviously we have come a long way from CRT technologies. Many, and actually most modern display technologies are HDR capable. And here are some examples of the typical display technologies that we encounter. Dual modulation LCD, where we modulate the backlight and the LCD independently. Then there's OLED. Direct view LED, which is mostly for billboards, and then the newest technology around is micro LED, which gives us smaller displays with this technology. So the problem is that the exact display capabilities vary, and what can we do about this? Can we still maintain fidelity with these varying technologies? And yes, there are ways to do that. So not every element in the HDR ecosystem is equally capable. Cameras, encodings, etc. We can't limit the HDR ecosystem to the least common denominator. This would really leave a lot of capabilities on the table. But we can implement approaches for optimized mapping of signals, content, and intent. And I think this is something we will talk in this meeting later on significantly more. So the approach is called tone mapping, or more accurately color volume mapping. And this is a very integral part of many HDR implementations nowadays. So what does this mean? Let me give you an example here a bit from the printing side of things. So let's assume I have this high fidelity, low dynamic range image. And now I want to get this to newsprint, offset, or fine art. And in that order, the color volume increases. And if I want to get these images there, I make this simulation here. I can get through the three targets with color or gamut mapping. Can you click? And yeah, obviously we can use ICC workflows to facilitate this. So the color volume is limited, for example, by the peak white of the medium. Newsprint has a lower albedo reflectance than fine art print. So this is not necessarily the best if you want to replicate HDR or the fullest of HDR. Next slide. So now if we go towards emissive displays, we can actually do more. So we can obviously show this LDR image on an SDR display, but we might get better results if we take an HDR image, and now we can map these onto the different capability displays, even high-end HDR displays. But if we now want to map them accurately as well, we need to apply, again, color or gamut mapping, but this time in HDR. Next slide. And here's an example of a color gamut of an HDR display that was maybe created on an HDR display. Click. Which might look like this. Next click. And we want to get it to a consumer display that has a significantly smaller color volume. And we obviously do this using tone mapping. So this can be achieved and supported by static or dynamic metadata. And this is something, again, we will hear more about it later on. But if everything works well, we get a faithfully reproduced image displayed on a target display. Next slide. And obviously, we can also get this on a printer through these tone mapping processes.
Timo?
So I mentioned metadata, and there are several HDR standards out there, such as Dolby Vision, HDR10, HDR10 Plus, etc., that utilize image metadata. And metadata can provide information about the image context. So display toolmapper can use this image metadata to optimize the image, and it can have a significant impact on image appearance. For example, here's if we map based on metadata onto the runners area, then this is in focus. But I can also expose the conversion of the tool mapping to show you the clouds in the sky, or the last example, you can look at, okay, I want to see what the cameraman is doing here. Click. So it's highly beneficial to fidelity if we can dial in this correctly, and this is particularly important for movies and photos. And as I mentioned, many of these pipelines are established, but the formats differ in capabilities. Next slide. So the current state of HDR, I hinted at that at the very beginning. Over the past 10 years, a complex and efficient ecosystem has been established. And you can see this full pipeline is available from start to end. And with that, just to summarize quickly, we have all the perceptual aspects established. We can capture HDR without artifacts. There is tool mapping enabled. And we have HDR-capable displays. And HDR, with that, is established as foundational component defining today's image fidelity. But there are still several areas where HDR can benefit other technologies. And to close out with HDR, you can feel the heat, but you can create an experience as if you're there. And with that, that closes my slide deck. Thanks.